So today we're going to talk about taxis in the era of Uber, and then we're going to talk about Eichlers in the era of teardowns. We'll start with taxis first, and we're glad to welcome staff photographer and videographer Veronica Weber. Thanks for joining us. Your cover story today was an in-depth look at the taxi business locally, some of the taxi drivers and what they're struggling with now that the ride-sharing companies have come onto the scene. So Veronica, what was kind of your takeaway from the overall picture of business right now for taxi drivers?
Yeah, it's tough being in the cab business these days. I talked to a number of drivers. I talked to some of the owners of some of the companies, and they are really feeling a squeeze. They've all expressed that they've seen at least a 50% drop in their business since these rideshare companies, Uber and Lyft, kind of came into the scene kind of around 2012, 2013. And they've been in Palo Alto for, I think, a year or two at least. And it's just they've lost a lot of business because these rideshare companies have been kind of luring these younger demographics. I talked to Larry Silva, who's the owner, he's the president and the general manager of the Yellow Checker Cab Company. And he's said that like 85% of the after bar crowd, the people getting out of bars and clubs late at night, Friday and Saturday night, kind of this like peak period for a cab driver to earn a lot of money. 85% of that is gone.
Wow.
Because a lot of people, they get out of the bar, they use their apps to order ride.
They don't have to pay.
They don't have to pay.
This person.
But it seems to be not just a lifestyle issue for the rider, but it also seems to be like a big lifestyle difference for the driver. Because one thing that struck me from reading your story is that many of the Uber drivers, as we know, are like part-timers. They have other jobs. This is something they do on the side.
Yeah.
For many of the people, the cab drivers you spend time with, this seems like it's almost like their life. Like it's been their lifelong dream, and they do like these like 80-hour shifts.
Yeah.
And so given that they're feeling the squeeze now, as you say, how are they coping with the fact that something they've invested so much of their life into, because they don't have like a software engineering job, they do it half the time. So how do they cope with this loss of income?
Yeah, for them, it's been definitely a big blow because a lot of them kind of consider this their livelihood. I talked to a number of people, and there's a fair number of these taxi drivers that are coming from a particular state in India, Punjab, and it's in northern India. And back in the 80s and the 90s, they said that they faced a lot of oppression from like political unrest, and they came over here to Silicon Valley and kind of heard like, oh, cab driving, it's this great opportunity. You just have to worry about paying for your car and your basic expenses, but you can work your own hours anytime that you want.
You're your own boss.
Get in the car, be your own boss. And a lot of their fellow countrymen had come over earlier and like really established some really good business. And they would come over here, and a lot of them have families, so it's like this perfect balance where they could take the kids to school on their own schedules and not have to worry about logging in and checking in with their boss. Can I drop my kid off to school?
Yeah.
So it's been this huge adjustment for them because they would in the early days, like the boom years, I guess you could call it, they were picking like 20 calls per shift on average, and some of the cab drivers...
Is a shift like 8 hours, or is a shift longer than that?
It's always been longer. I think they've always been driving for at least like 10 hours typically per shift. And they don't always drive, I think on average they're saying they drove like 6 days a week now. But I think back in the boom years you could work, like Tommy Steele, who was one of the drivers I talked to, he said, you could put in hours and hours and hours for like 4 days at a time, and then you would have the rest of the week to kind of relax. But now that's not even an option.
Okay.
Now it's kind of, in order to kind of make ends meet, in order to pay off the expenses that you have, paying into a cab company, the licensing and insurance and all that, now you really have to work at least like 12 hours at least. And a lot of these guys, they're coming, with this background as drivers in kind of this like labor industry. So they don't have the training, they haven't pursued education. And
All right, to Gennadi's point about this is their livelihood,
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
it, and then there's these encroachers.
Yeah,
essentially.
so a lot of them actually expressed to me that what they're going to have to start thinking about doing, and a lot of them have already done. So Bikram Singh, who owns Yellow Cab Company Peninsula, he was saying that he's lost at least half of his drivers were either going to some of the ride-sharing companies, or they're kind of choosing to stay in the transportation industry, working as drivers, or the
Private-
shuttle
like private
drivers for these technology companies like Google or Yahoo.
We hear a lot about the advantage of these transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft in the sense that you don't need to have cash on hand, everything's paid for through mobile app. So there's legitimate reasons why people like them. And a devil's advocate could say, as I will say right now, why don't cab companies allow the same options to make themselves more competitive?
Right.
Isn't just a case of like a better service displacing a worse one?
Yeah, definitely.
So how do you cope with that?
The ride-sharing companies have really launched onto this idea where people just don't want to carry cash anymore. It's ease of use. You can see who's arriving, who the driver is. You can rate them. You can just tip them in the app if you want to.
So have the cab companies thought about kind of integrating these kinds of systems?
Some companies I spoke to have actually designed their own apps. Yellow Checker Cab Company of Silicon Valley has their own app that's been around for a few years. But the problem that cab companies experience that have really kind of stifled this ability to kind of keep up and offer the same perks that Uber and Lyft have is they're faced with all these regulations with cities where, for instance, in San Jose, they've mandated that cab drivers have to charge $3.50 to get in to the car, and then $3 per mile. And that's standard. You can't change that. It's unwavering. So you can raise your rates, but that's the lowest rate you can offer.
So $6.50 if you're going 1 mile just to get in
Yeah,
and go.
yeah. So
Okay.
automatically the passenger is going to be paying a lot more than, say, if they were taking Uber and Lyft, which they're regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission. And it's kind of, the rates are unregulated. So that's why you see now, I think the rate is, it averages from 2 to 3 to get into the car, and then it's about $1 per mile.
Yeah.
So they really, lowered the costs for the consumer, which is great. But kind
the
of flip
squeeze
the
on the
coin,
taxi.
they also have these surge pricing. And Lyft recently, I was just reading about it this morning, they just faced this issue where they didn't, they used to have a cap on their surge pricing. It could only be a certain percentage of the base fare could get raised. Well, actually, they didn't tell their passengers this, but they removed that cap. So now the surge, and this is some of the complaints that Uber passengers had some years ago, and it seems to be the case with Lyft as well, where they can control the price, and
Right. I mean, it helps
on
when
the
you have
fly.
one company managing everything as opposed to like 1,000 different cabbies, each with their own systems. But I guess one thing that's kind of clear to me is that the big kind of issue for the cabbies, unlike other industries, including our own, which are facing competition
Right.
from new sources. In this case, it's not just a matter of making a better product or making a competitive product. It's also the fact that you have to play by a different set of rules
Yeah.
than
Yeah,
the others.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
it seems to be one of the big themes of your story that some of the cab drivers are basically arguing that it's about time that the cities
Yeah.
and the state kind of revise some of these rules to make it more level playing field. So what are some of these kind of city restrictions? You mentioned the fare, but I believe there's other rules that seem to be like even more kind of tight, like the fact that you can't pick up a passenger on the way back
Yeah.
if you're like in a different
You have to
city.
get a licensing for each
Right.
city that you go to.
Yeah, so each city has control of the taxi industry, so they can determine what the rules are of what the rules of the road are for these cab companies. So, for instance, I think 4 cities in Santa Clara County require taxi drivers to take a written driver's test. 6 of the Santa Clara County cities require unique fingerprinting and background checks. So that means if you want to work in each of these 6 cities, you have to pay to have a background check and fingerprinting every single time.
And by work in, you mean pick up passengers from, because
True.
Yes.
you
It's
can't,
not like
you
you
can't say
can't-
I
you
can't,
can still
I can't,
drive
I can't
through.
drive across the border because I didn't do my fingerprints. Okay.
Right,
Just
right.
picking up
Yeah,
passengers.
so it's wherever you can pick up a passenger, and you also have to have driver's permits to operate in the cities, and the company itself has to have a separate permit to be able to operate in each city. So, if you were picking someone up from Sunnyvale, for instance, and dropping them off in Palo Alto, but you don't have a Palo Alto license or a driver's license in Palo Alto, you can't then, someone can't flag you down and you can open the car and let them in and pick up that fare. Technically, that's not allowed. So whereas these ride-sharing companies, you can pick up passengers in any city practically. And
Wow.
So have they had any success, the cab drivers, in convincing local jurisdictions to soften the rules?
Yeah. Some of them have kind of gone forward and spoken to city officials. I was speaking with Jim Griffith, who's a council member for the city of Sunnyvale, and he was saying that actually they made some really good progress. They had a study session earlier in 2015, and then they recently went to vote, and they amended some of their ordinances. So they used to require, for instance, a vehicle inspection 4 times a year. Now they've kind of lessened that down to just 1 a year, which is very, they were comparing to other cities around Santa Clara County and what they do, and that seems to be the course is only 1 vehicle inspection. And they used to have a paper map test. So drivers would have to show proof that they used a paper
all
map
the-
and knowledge.
okay.
But most drivers are just using GPS nowadays. And I think they even had something that they had a uniform requirement at one
I've
point.
never seen a uniform on a taxi cab driver.
I think
cool
there was
cap.
like a dress code
okay.
standard. And so they've reduced the cost of some of the licensing. So there's been steps, and I know that Sunnyvale, most of the Santa Clara County cities belong to the Cities Association of Santa Clara County, which is working to kind of have this overall agreement from city, county-wide to kind of create this more streamlined regulation system. It's called reciprocity, where you could have one driver's permit and vehicle inspection and fingerprinting, and then it would be accepted, like all countywide.
The EU model.
Yeah. It's the regional approach.
Yeah, it's a
Exactly.
regional approach, and this is what the cab companies really want. They understand that this is just the free marketplace. The consumers are going to gravitate to what they feel is best, but they just feel like that'll kind of even out the playing field for them, and because these regulations have been preventing them from being able to compete what they say fairly to these other companies.
And on the other end of the equation, then the CPUC is also adding some regulations, are they not, of Uber and Lyft and the other what's called transportation network companies.
Yeah. I know they recently just passed an update to their regulations where they're now going to require vehicle inspections to be conducted in a licensed mechanic facility of some sort. You can't just get approved by representatives from a company, for instance.
Okay.
It has to go into a licensed mechanic now. And they're also requiring these rideshare companies to display their emblems on the front and the back of the car. So we'll help, with enforcement to identify, who's to differentiate from a personal car and one that's being used for these
Someone
ride-sharing
doesn't
companies.
get into your car accidentally.
Yeah.
But these are all just kind of seem like kind of small marginal steps that aren't going to kind of address the big issues around this competition between these companies and the taxi cabs.
Right.
But it seems like the fundamental issues that taxi cabs have a colossal marketing problem is that you have these 2 high-tech giants, more than 2 now. I guess there's a ton now, but they have all these advantages like the network, the lesser regulations. So when you mention that to like a cabbie, what advantages do they see taxi cabs as having over the other services?
Right. Well, the rigorous standards that they're kind of held under, as they see it, actually they think that that's really a selling point because they do get fingerprinted, and they are getting really thoroughly, background checks and routinely monitored. And they say, when you ride in a cab, you're safer. Because if you were to ride in one of these rideshare companies, they have a more broader approach to the background checks. They're not using the fingerprinting service, for instance. And they also agree that kind of the standard in the rates, even though it is harming them, at least in a cab, you're always gonna, you're always gonna pay the same rate. It's never, you're not you're never going to have the fluctuations of really low rates one day and then maybe you go to a Giants game and it's like a surge pricing and maybe it'll cost you hundreds of dollars to get home and you just don't have any awareness until it's too late. Yes, and so
So stability is a big selling point, I guess.
Yeah.
Safety, kind of knowing what you're getting.
safety and stability. Yeah.
You did some interesting reporting because you were out there and in the wee hours of the morning with these cabbies. What is kind of their overall level of optimism right now? I mean, are they just like barely clinging to their livelihoods? Are they thinking that this is affecting their families somehow?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I talked to cab drivers of a range of ages, and I feel like the drivers who are younger, I would say 40 and under, really have a dismal outlook for the future. They just see it as this is the future of the industry. We just can't keep up to technology, and we really need to just realistically start thinking about what's next for ourselves and going into these other transportation jobs. Whereas I feel like the older cab drivers who've been through different economic periods, for instance, I talked to Tommy and I talked to this driver named Carl, and they were here during a recession in the 80s. And so they've seen boom and they've seen really
Bust, yeah.
busts and struggles. So they kind of have this, more broad outlook where it's like, this is just riding the tide. This is just, in any business, you're going to have really good years and you're going to have really bad years.
So they don't think that Uber and Lyft are like a disruptive force that totally changes the industry? They think they'll just go away or something?
They do feel it's definitely disruptive, but they're optimistic that maybe things will change. Maybe some ordinances will be kind of yielding a little bit and, give them a more fair, what they say is a more fair opportunity to compete. And it's funny, some of them actually said that in 15 years they expect that all cab and rideshare companies are going to be obsolete to autonomous vehicles. So they're really looking far off into the future.
Well, maybe because they are in their later stages in life, then they're thinking 15 years, oh well, we will have run out our careers by that point.
Yeah. So that they're more optimistic than, because they're on the verge of retirement. So maybe they just have this, fond, this,
Yeah, good memories from their times, and it'll all roll out. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for bringing us this story. I hope everyone is reading it online and in the paper and seeing your great photography as well.
Thank you.
So thank you. Let's switch over to Eichler's very popular style of architecture in Palo Alto. And this week at the City Council, the subject of something of a showdown between Eichler owners.
Yeah, speaking of tradition being disrupted, this is the latest episode in the long serial called the Eichler Uprising. This is the third application for the single-story overlay that the council has been considering since last year. And as I'm sure some of our viewers know, this is just a zoning designation that basically prohibits new two-story homes and additions, second-story additions to existing homes. And so, as in the past, but on a much grander scale, we had big kind of conflict and tension between neighbors, with some wanting it and some hating it. And the council said this is to be continued on May 2nd, but we heard from many residents.
This was the Royal Manor neighborhood, which is in South Palo Alto, roughly bounded by Lewis and Loma Verde and Greer. And 200, how many? 200 some homes?
Yeah, there's like 203 homes, or
Yeah.
202 depending on how you draw the map. There's one corner home. But about a little over 200.
Yeah. And as you said, not the first time that this single-story overlay has been rolled out. I was interested to find out that there's like nearly 20 Eichler neighborhoods or tracts in Palo Alto, some 2,700 homes. This is an issue that's come up before and likely will continue to be a hot issue.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's funny, just as I was writing about this story, I just learned there's another application for single-story overlay in a different neighborhood. That story's to come, but it's a big wave. It's probably the biggest land use trend in Palo Alto right now, which does not include office buildings.
So there's a couple of themes: property rights versus privacy rights,
Right.
And then also democracy, the small D,
That's right.
democracy.
Yeah.
Let's take the privacy versus property first. What's the at issue here?
Well, the whole reason for the proponents of single-story overlays are citing for why they want them is because of the way Eichler communities are constructed. They're not like other neighborhoods. They're built as tracts, and they're all kind of mostly a single-story with large glass doors leading out to big backyards. Very much a sense of nature coming indoors, blurring the line between inside and out. And the idea is that when you have a community like that, if you build a two-story home, which among proponents are basically known as a monster house or a two-story tear down, that's kind of the terminology we use. When a monster house goes up, it impacts the privacy of everybody, at least 3 people, your neighbors, the person on the street, possibly as many as 6 if you have other streets behind you. So because it has such a big impact on quality of life, the privacy concern, they want to prohibit these.
Right. Some neighborhoods had CC&Rs, covenants, and restrictions already kind of built in to the Eichler neighborhood. But this is kind of taking some people by surprise, though, because they bought their Eichler and they thought, well, we can add on. The family may move in, parents may move in, we may have some children. So from their perspective, this is something that was totally unexpected and could really harm not only property value but their own plans for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I spoke to one gentleman who moved to Royal Manor about a decade ago, and he and his family were going to have kids. They were looking at various neighborhoods. They were considering Green Meadow, but they chose Royal Manor precisely because Green Meadow had a single-story overlay, and this one didn't. And so there was a plan to expand once they have kids. And many of the people who oppose it for the same reason. Many of them come from cultures where it's common to live with a parent, or grandparents in the house. So they want to, or in a few cases, they're expecting kids really soon. Young families that just moved in. So they want to have the option of building a second story, and they think that this is taking this away from them is a violation of property rights. And Royal Manor actually doesn't have the covenant, but some other neighborhoods do.
Okay.
And of course, even when you have the covenant, to enforce it it's very expensive. You have to go to court, and few people would be willing to do that, which is why these SSO, the process was created.
Yeah. It just seems like with these neighborhoods, it's going to continue to be an issue, but I think the process that they went through was probably the biggest spark of dissent. Obviously, privacy and property are huge issues too, but how exactly are the rules structured so that the overlay application can be made?
Well, it puts a lot of the onus on neighbors and residents to kind of do their own signature gathering and do their own petitioning. And because the process places such a huge emphasis on neighbors doing it themselves, it inevitably leads to friction. We haven't seen it on such a big scale in the past because, for example, in Los Arboles, which received its SSO, had it approved last year, there was overwhelming support in the neighborhood, so it was, the petition process wasn't an issue. Here in Royal Manor, there's a 70% threshold, but many of the people who signed it, like 17 or so, afterwards wanted to take out the signature because they said they were approached by a neighbor at a barbecue or they were making food for their kids. Somebody comes in and knocks and they're like, yeah, I'll sign it. And then they're basically saying, we didn't have a lawyer, we didn't really examine it, we didn't know we're basically signing away property rights.
So they
there's
felt
no
not
official-
fully informed.
Yeah, and there were also questions about neighbors put together a frequently asked questions list, and there was a suggestion that if you sign it, it's only going to lead to a ballot later on. This is just a vote for a vote as opposed to a vote for a single-story overlay. And they corrected this FAQ about a month later, but some people said they didn't receive the corrected version, and so there was also that issue. You had many cases in which, at the meeting last Monday, several speakers said, I signed it, then my husband came home and said, you did what? And then we went back. There are a couple of those cases. So now the support is 63%, below the 70% threshold that you need. And so you do have a lot of people raising concerns about the process, the way it was used here, and the way it's laid out in the city's ordinance, because it does put such a huge role in neighbors to do it themselves.
Okay. So that is actually, I believe, the Planning Commission, was it, already suggested that there might be a second look at the single-story overlay process and trying to figure out how to get a little bit more concrete.
Yeah, I mean,
sense.
staff suggested it in its
Okay.
report for this. They're basically saying no matter how this goes, we should take a fresh look because, and not to mention the fact that the people who are asking you to sign are already kind of inherently biased because they want this. So it's not the same as having like the city send you an official petition laying out the rules, you know. And, I mean, and I have no reason to think proponents of the overlay were intentionally trying to kind of push this on other
Yeah.
people. I just think it's a complicated enough issue that if you bring it up at a barbecue and give somebody a petition, misunderstandings could occur, and in some cases probably did occur.
Exactly. Now, the city already has this other process called individual review, which is in place for any time that someone proposes a second-story addition or a two-story house.
Right.
So that's kind of an interesting factor because I remember there was another neighborhood on Richardson Court in which this issue, just simply the issue of a house being sort of out of place that was
Right.
proposed, came up, and the privacy issue has come up as well. There are things that can be done with windows, frosting of windows, so that privacy is retained by neighbors. So I'm wondering how come we have this SSO, it's a very large kind of broad sweep overlay instead of individual review.
Quite simply, many people, including several council people, think that the individual review process is a failure, that it hasn't produced the kind of projects that the city wants to see. The house that you mentioned in Richardson Court did end up getting constructed, and it is 2 stories, and and Richardson Court is an Eichler block too, so they're not going for the SSO at this time, but I feel like people who are going for a single-story overlay point at that house, and there's maybe 4 or 5 other examples in which a 2-story home, sometimes a colonial or like a, not a colonial, but like a Mediterranean style in
Right.
Eichler, and they're like, we have an IR process, and this is what it brings. And the city right now is kind of cognizant of that, so they have formed a group of stakeholders to take a look at the individual review process, which applies to all neighborhoods, 2-story homes, and so they're trying to tweak it to make sure it's more stringent in creating compatible neighborhoods.
Yeah, because one could just argue, why don't you just improve the individual review process and not even deal with the SSO?
Yeah, just lack of trust in it.
Yeah, so there are 2 council members, 2 who had interesting proposal, Holman and I think Du Bois, for an architectural neighborhood overlay of some sort.
Yeah, I know Tom Du Bois did talk about it in the past. This is something that other cities have. I know Cupertino has it. Basically, design guidelines just for Eichlers. So it's not just restricting second stories. I mean, you can still build a second story, but if you do, here are strict kind of regulations you have to follow regarding things like window placement. You know, it has to be high enough where you can't peek in the neighbors. Maybe frosted glass, as you mentioned. How it's laid out so it doesn't look too massive
Right.
when it's surrounded by small houses.
Yeah, where the trees are on the outside.
Yeah, and this seems to be like a potential area of compromise between the 2 sides because, I mean, people who oppose single-story overlays are saying they would be more than happy to talk about design guidelines. So if they do expand, they respect the neighbor's privacy. The council hasn't gone far enough to kind of push that yet, but
Okay.
that could be where we're going.
Okay, and Jim Keane was not terribly excited about that, city manager Jim Keane, just because of the additional staffing that would take up, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while since I discussed that particular proposal. And I should point out, this week the council didn't discuss it at all.
Yeah.
They basically gave the public a chance to talk. There were like 65 cards, like 40,
Wow.
40 people spoke. A bunch more said they'll speak at the next meeting. So I'll be looking forward to May 2nd to hear what Jim Keane and the council members say about kind of improving the process to either improve the SSO process or improve the broader design process so that SSOs become less needed.
Yeah, okay. Well, great, thanks for the good discussions on taxis and Eichlers. That's kind of a little bit of a interesting mix this week. You can always check us out on PaloAltoOnline.com. And if you'd like to talk about either taxis or Eichlers, go to PaloAltoOnline.com/square. That's it for this week.